Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture on designing experiences and interactions. My name is Alexa Polman. I am the subject leader for wearable technology at the London College of Fashion. Now, for today's lecture, I thought it's nice to start with an example of my own work, mostly because we are going to talk about designing experiences and interactions in the context of fashion, of course. And in that, I think there's one work that I'd like to share with you that I've produced with my studio, Peu Porter, where we've really kind of looked at interaction and experience in form of a game. And the game is called Wear and Seek. And it was an experience that we created for the Design Festival in London in 2017 and showed again at the Museum of London later on in 2018, but also at Fashion Clash Festival in the Netherlands. And I think what it really does is it gives you hopefully a sort of inspirational beginning to this lecture. So here's a little video that I'm sharing, and I'm going to talk over it to shorten our time. What we did in this project was that we really looked at how we interact with machines these days and how we are being watched over by machines. So the project is very much a comment on our current surveillance climate. But also it looked mostly at how this will actually change the way that we design. And that was one of the key questions, because we did design for the human eye for a long time. But by now, of course, we are not only designing for the human eye anymore. And what you can see here is we had audiences come into the room of the exhibition where upon entry they were given a bib that they could wear themselves. And then they had various devices, augmented reality and heat camera devices that would allow them to view each other through a machine eye, basically. And it was a game because we basically used the garments as triggers that would trigger those devices. And so there was a second layer over the actual fashion material that the garment is that would become visible when you use these devices. And not all of them would trigger those devices. So it was they had to wear the device and then seek for the overlay experience or information. And I think, this was just a short intro to showcase that, of course, when we talk about interaction and experience, we really can open this up quite a bit in regards to how it could influence how we as fashion designers work. Now, I'll go back to the roots a bit more with this one. Because, of course, both designing interactions and designing experiences became more and more relevant with technology entering our everyday lives. Now, you'd be surprised to see that this film, which was is from 1947, and it's called the television The Eye of Tomorrow by J.K. Raymond Millett. It actually shows people interacting with what we would today call mobile phones. And mobile phones didn't exist back then. So it's really exciting to see how this film predicts these little moments where we are so focused on our phone that we don't actually realize what's going on in the world around us anymore. And this prediction is, I think, something that we as designers in general are quite good at doing. But it's also something that introduces the idea of human-computer interaction, which is, of course, what we are going to talk a bit about. So it's kind of easy to understand that until the 1970s or the late 1970s even, this discipline wasn't really necessary. So especially because computers were only used by professionals who would know how to use them. Now, with personal computing, of course, becoming something of an everyday tasks for everyone in our surroundings and ourselves, it became apparent that we really need to think about how people interact with devices, and how their experience around devices will actually be one that is enjoyable, doesn't frustrate. And we all have this knowledge of technology. When it doesn't work, it really frustrates us. So the idea of interaction and experience is, of course, to a great part to ensure that we have a pleasurable experience, or one that we maybe don't even realize we're having because it just happens. So, so much for this film. I think it sort of shows why there is a necessity for it, but also what its influence is on our everyday life now. And still, I'm taking you on a bit of a journey back in time. We can actually go even further. So this was a film, of course, from 1947. As said, back then, mobile phones didn't exist, but someone predicted them. But if we go back even further, we can really look at how interaction and experience design is something that, although we think of it today as something that we design only in the context of technical devices, they have existed for much longer. And so I brought you these very old sort of wearable devices. And I think it's quite clear what the one on the right hand does. It's a calculator. It's an abacus in form of a ring. But the one on the left side, I often ask my students what they think it might be. One of the greatest answers to that was that someone thought it might be an early projector. I think that would be really interesting. But really it is a watch. It's a portable watch. And it was designed by Henlein in, oh God, when was it? 2000. We are now in 2021, and I think it was pretty much about 500 years ago, so around 1500. So that just as a sort of intro to where we already saw devices being designed, and of course they have some form of interaction in them. Now, the one on the left is definitely one that I wouldn't know how to read, although of course it already has the shape that we now know from a watch being set in a circle, for example. But it's very interesting because although back then it must have had some logic to it on how it worked, of course today it's harder for us to grasp how this might be read. So in theory, we could consider this, for today at least, a sort of not working user experience or interaction design, although of course it's still a very pleasurable artifact. So that one would be an example for not well working design interaction. The other one, of course, because it's so straightforward and we know the abacus, is like, yes, this one would be one that we understand and therefore maybe be categorized as an example of good interaction design. So, moving into the here and now, I think what I want to focus you on to start with is that when you design interactions and experiences, you definitely focus on the user. And these two terms, user experience and user interaction, which have different forms of short language that I don't know why there are so many for UX, and I'm sure there's actually more for UI as well, but just put them there in case you ever have come across them and wondered. But both of these terms are sometimes really used interchangeably. And to some degree that is really easy to understand because they do overlap quite a bit. And it seems also quite straightforward when you try to explain them. So, of course, user experiences are about the experiences we have around a product, or how we engage with a product, whereas the interaction design part can probably more be focused on the direct interaction. And the experience is something that is going much broader in a way, because the first time you interact with a product isn't necessarily the first time you experience it. I think that is my definition of the difference between those two, but as said, they are overlapping, and I think it's not necessary for you to really try and define them per se, although I think helping your own kind of, well, project or product, it's good to have both of them in mind, and sometimes ask yourself whether you're now designing an interaction or an experience. So when we go back into and try to kind of relate this back into fashion, though, I would say that there's something that I really want you to focus on, and that's that when you come from a fashion background, you have probably been asked before to consider a consumer or customer, and you probably made a customer board of sorts. And what you did in there is that you tried to imagine their surroundings, their social standing, their general lifestyle, really, and of course their interests. And so you kind of picture the person that you're designing for. You might even have put a name or an age group on there. And so you gave them a sort of profile. Now, that is, of course, relevant, but within the UI and UX sector, what you do is really that you focus in on that consumer, on their every action, really. So you're less focusing on their background and more on the way that they use a product. And I think that it's sort of a more micro view. It zooms in, really. And I think that can be done in many ways within fashion as well. So if you consider designing, let's say, a jacket, and you place your buttons and your buttonholes, you make sure that the buttonholes have a certain width, so actually the button can fit through. That seems just logical, but at the same time, it also ensures that whoever wears the jacket will actually have an experience that is pleasurable, or maybe even an experience that goes unnoticed. And that's okay, because what it doesn't do is it doesn't annoy, because if I can't fit the button through the buttonhole, I will probably not buy the jacket. And there's many more examples you could bring in this context, but this would basically show how the interaction with the jacket plays a big part. And therefore you have actually done interaction and experience design before. You just might not have put your focus onto it. And this brings us really to 4 steps that I would like you to consider for your design process going further. So the first one, of course, is when we talk about technology, especially, we are looking at the user, but we are also looking at the functionality. And for the term functionality, it can be said that, of course, it is something that would happen, for example, when you design a device that is collecting bodily data, and that's just one example. And it is something that is the function that then gives the whole product a reason to exist. But it's also a sort of step that we could consider as design engineering. And in that context, it is, of course, giving your direction of your design a very specific outline. That might be very different from designing a garment per se when you start. Although even in there, we can see quite a bit of engineering around fit and body. So you actually are working with data there as well. Now, the next step would be that you think about the wireframe. And wireframe is a big word, but it basically is a storyboard. A storyboard, which is sort of the part of the design where you really start thinking about the person that uses or activates the device or the experience. So what is a wireframe? It is basically a two-dimensional outline, so it can be a sketch of a web page or an app mostly, and it's basically the storyboard that makes you think through all the steps that the person using your product or device or experience will need to take. So in a simple way, it's a sort of step-by-step description of the different actions you need to take. Be it pushing a button, swiping left or right, turning a device on or off, and so on. Why is it important? Because it really gives you focus again on those interactions that you are actually designing when you design a product. And this was sort of the zoom in. And then, of course, you can also zoom out a bit more. So that brings us to the user journey. In the user journey, it is really important to think about how your user has needs and pain points, if you want so. So the point of this user journey is that you really understand user behavior. You uncover sort of gaps in the user experience. So when does your user see your product for the first time? Why does he or she or they see it? And I think it is something where you really kind of see the product in the bigger picture of the life of your user. So I think what I would like you to do here is get inspired by the idea that you can observe your user and their interaction with the device. And I think the other important part of this is that, again, it gives you a focus on interaction, of course, but also the overall experience. So is it overall an experience that you want to be a highlight, or is it overall an experience that you want to actually be unnoticed? So it kind of slots into our everyday. So the confrontation, basically, that you allow your user to have with your product or experience, is it high or low? It also takes into account other contextual information, such as how often would your user actually interact with the product. So it's more temporal as well. And then going further, we come to the last but very important step, which is usability testing. So having planned out and thought through and designed all these previous steps, of course, it is sort of a fiction in your head that you created. And what we normally do within fashion at this point is we produce a prototype and we then go to a fitting to see whether it fits, right? And there's multiple fittings usually. So it's quite similar within design interaction or designing interactions or experiences, as if you now have your prototype and you give it to someone to see how they would use it. And that, of course, will confirm or direct your assumptions that you made basically in making your wireframe and your user journey. And it might mean that you have to go back to the drawing board. It might mean that you get confirmation, but it is one of the most important steps, of course. So you really can learn from the problems or the issues that the person that is using your device during their interaction with it has. Now, to sum it up, what we want to really focus on is to think about who are you designing for. And that is, for me, in a nutshell, focusing on interaction and experiences. And the product is, of course, part of it, but it's sitting within this context. Next, I thought it might be nice to also introduce you to this idea that we have moved from the information age into the experience age. And next to who you are designing for, you can open up the idea of what you are designing. Now, just as a sort of background here, the information age is historically a period that sort of began mid-20th century, and it's characterized by a rapid shift from the industry that was established by the Industrial Revolution to the economy that is primarily based in the information technology age. And the experience age, well, it is happening right now. And I think, therefore, the definition of it might be sort of fluctuating. And I don't want to pinpoint it directly, but I think it really says it on the tin. It really moves us away from this idea of connecting people through informational facts to connecting them through experiences. And so it also is maybe best described in an example that I've often read about in this context by looking at Facebook versus Snapchat. Okay, so in Facebook, you actually get quite a bit of text and profile and information that sort of sits there and stays there. And so it's really information heavy. Now, within Snapchat, not only is your moment and the existing and experiencing in the moment the main focus, it also gets rid of all this archival work in a way. So I think that those two are good to illustrate, but I have brought you another example a little bit later. Though I want to sort of go back to this question of what are you designing? And whilst for the longest time, we as designers have focused on product, it really is, I think, essential at this point to kind of broaden out and say, you might be designing a process. You might be designing a user interface. You might be designing a movement, so a physical movement, a body movement, because as soon as I touch my phone, I move, right? As soon as I get into my jacket, I move in a certain way. And how beautiful would it be if we would actually start thinking about that as part of our design when we design a jacket? So you could design an action or an experience, really. And there's many other ways that you can start thinking about this. And I think that's the beauty as well of this field, that you can come from a couple of different angles, really. Now, here's one example I thought, I find it quite hilarious in a way. And I thought it's really nicely illustrating this experience age idea for me within the fashion context again. So this is from 2018, and it's the Coco Games Center. It traveled through Asia, and I think it was in Tokyo, in Singapore, and in Hong Kong and Chengdu. And it was a pop-up experience, and one that was widely shared in the social media. And there were it was basically an arcade where you have different games, such as a crane game, for example, and you could then get dressed in the brand's classic tweed and use one of these machines. And so what we see is really that shopping is getting more performance oriented. And we've seen this for some years now. Burberry is one of the examples for that as well, who have done brilliantly over the last 2 decades now already. And of course, the attached behavioral study to this would be game study, right? Because we as humans, we like to play. It's called Homo Ludens. And gamification within shopping experience has definitely become quite an important driver for the industry. So just one example to kind of memorize the idea of the experience age. So this brings me to the end, and I hope it's sort of a nice first primer into the idea of designing interactions and experiences within the fashion realm. I have a list of experiments that you can do at home to sort of start immersing yourself in this world, and also to try and reset your brain to designing in them. So I suggest that just observe yourself really if you're at home. Think about every interaction that you take, maybe in a certain amount of time, and how would you define these as interactions? But also maybe look just back at what you've done this week and what you would consider an experience within that week. And where there might be an experience that you haven't realized, or where there might be one that you feel is maybe not necessarily also linked to technology, but try to define why or why not they are experiences. So for both of the above, I then also suggest to note them down and try to put them on a scale, basically. Try to see whether they were good or bad, whether they were pleasurable or unnoticed, whether they were big or small, whatever you consider your scale to be. Yeah, that's all from me today on designing interactions and experiences. I hope you learned and enjoyed this lecture.